It was the bitter winter of 1944. Snow blanketed the remote edges of a small, war-torn village in Germany, and the air was heavy with the scent of smoke and despair. The echoes of artillery had long faded here, but the terror of human cruelty remained, etched into every shattered building, every frozen footprint in the mud. Inside a makeshift camp, a line of German women prisoners of war shuffled forward, trembling in the biting cold, their eyes reflecting exhaustion, fear, and the grim acceptance of a fate they could hardly imagine. Orders had come down like the final hammer of a judged line-up at dawn. For weeks, these women had lived with hunger gnawing at their bellies and the relentless uncertainty of survival. Now, they faced what many believed was their last morning alive. The guards' boots crunched against the frost-bitten earth, a harsh counterpoint to the women's shallow, ragged breaths. The camp seemed suspended in time, a frozen tableau of human suffering, tension, and the fragile hope that miracles could still exist in the darkest of hours. And yet, as they stepped into the pale, grey light of dawn, something unimaginable unfolded. A pause, a gesture, a small kindness that would defy all expectation. It was a moment where humanity pierced through the armor of war, a quiet yet profound declaration that even in a world consumed by violence, compassion could still bloom. In that frozen morning, the impossible became real, and the lives of these women were touched in a way they had never dared to dream. The women stood in formation, the frozen earth biting through the soles of their worn boots, their bodies shivering under threadbare uniforms that had seen months of hardship and neglect. The dawn was pale and unforgiving, casting long shadows across the mud-smeared camp. Each breath they drew fogged in the frigid air, rising like ghostly wisps that mingled with the faint scent of smoke from distant fires. Their eyes, wide and wary, darted to the soldiers on either side, whose stern faces betrayed little, yet whose presence was a constant reminder of the fine line between life and death. They had been told to expect execution, a sentence handed down without trial, without mercy. It was a cruel certainty, one they had carried in their hearts since the previous night, and yet the human instinct to hope, irrational as it was, still flickered quietly beneath layers of fear. The camp itself seemed a relic of despair. Barbed wire fences framed the muddy expanse, the wooden watchtowers looming like silent sentinels against the grey horizon. Crates of supplies, long since pillaged or burned, lay scattered, their shattered remains hinting at a world that had once thrived but now existed only in fragments. The women, standing shoulder to shoulder, drew strength from one another, however faint, their shared fear binding them in ways words could not. Some of them had been nurses, others clerks, housewives, daughters. The war had taken them from familiar streets, warm kitchens, and quiet homes, placing them in a world defined by suffering, discipline, and constant uncertainty. And yet, even in that moment of impending doom, small acts of human kindness, once rare, now almost unimaginable, had the power to reach through the darkness. The guards shifted, their boots crunching against the frost, the sound a harsh percussion in the tense silence. A commanding officer approached the line, his movements deliberate, measured, yet there was a subtle softness in the way he looked at the women. His hands, gloved and steady, carried blankets folded neatly, and over them, a basket of bread, still warm from a fire somewhere just beyond the perimeter. The women blinked, unable to reconcile the sight before them with their expectations. Executioners did not carry gifts. Executioners did not pause to offer reassurance. Their minds raced, disbelief mingling with a fragile curiosity. Could this be a trick, some cruel jest before their final moments? One by one, the officer and his aides moved along the line, handing blankets to the trembling prisoners. The warmth of the thick fabric against their frozen shoulders was almost surreal. Some of the women pressed the blankets to their chests as if to absorb the fleeting comfort they provided. When the bread was offered, the women hesitated, their fingers brushing against the warm crusts as though touching a fragment of a life they had thought lost forever. The taste, when they dared to eat, was simple yet profound, a reminder of sustenance beyond mere survival. It was a sensation they had almost forgotten, nourishment without fear, without the gnawing anxiety of what each bite might cost them. There were no words for this sudden shift in the air, yet the silence spoke volumes. A soft nod here, a gentle hand placed on a shoulder there, conveyed what the soldiers' eyes could not. An acknowledgement of shared humanity, a fleeting but undeniable compassion. The women's hearts, once tightly coiled with fear, began to loosen in increments, their minds struggling to absorb the reality that not every human being they encountered in this frozen, war-torn world intended harm. In that suspended moment, as the snow continued to fall in delicate, ghostly flakes around them, they tasted something almost alien: relief. It was not merely the physical warmth that penetrated the cold. It was the recognition of their existence, their suffering, their fear. For months, they had been objects, numbers in a system designed to strip away identity, to reduce life to an equation of control and subjugation. Now, for the first time, someone had looked upon them and chosen to respond not with cruelty, but with deliberate, intentional care. One prisoner, a young woman whose hands shook violently, lifted her gaze to the officer's face and saw in his eyes the reflection of a principle long buried under the rubble of war mercy. Time itself seemed to stretch and warp. Moments, normally measured in seconds, expanded into something heavier, more profound. The crunch of boots, the whisper of the wind through the barbed wire, even the distant cawing of a crow. Each sound became a note in a symphony of tension and unexpected grace. The prisoners leaned slightly toward one another, drawn by shared astonishment, yet aware that nothing in this world came without consequence. And yet, in the midst of this harrowing tableau, they discovered a strange equilibrium, the possibility that kindness could exist, even where it was least expected. Even the guards themselves were transformed in that morning frost. The rigidity of their training, the mechanical detachment demanded by duty, softened in subtle ways. Hands that had held weapons now cradled blankets, eyes that had been trained to observe weakness now registered surprise, empathy, and perhaps even a quiet sense of pride. It was a delicate balance, the line between discipline and compassion. But in those precious minutes, it tilted irrevocably toward humanity. The women absorbed it all, sensing with every fiber of their being that this act, small as it seemed, would be remembered far beyond the barbed wire fences and frozen ground. When the last blanket was draped, when the final piece of bread was distributed, a stillness settled over the camp that was heavier than any sound. The women stood in awe, not only at the unexpected mercy, but at the simple fact that in a world defined by cruelty, something unlooked for could bloom. Their fingers clasped the edges of their blankets, eyes scanning the faces of soldiers who had once been indistinguishable from executioners, now indistinguishable from protectors. A new narrative, fragile yet enduring, began to take root even in a place built to extinguish hope. Compassion could survive. And so, as the frost-laden wind brushed against their faces, mingling with the mist of their own breath, the women felt it, the first flicker of warmth in their hearts since the war had swallowed their lives whole. It was a warmth born not of fire, not of shelter, but of recognition, the recognition that, even in moments when death seemed imminent, mercy and empathy could assert their quiet, indelible power. It was a dawn not only of light but of possibility, a morning that would live forever in the memories of those who had been on the line. trembling, believing that the end was nigh, and discovering instead that humanity could shine even in the darkest hours. As the line of women shifted forward, a quiet disbelief began to ripple through the formation. They had come to expect brutality at every turn, to anticipate the cold indifference of the men who now stood before them. The officers' faces, carved with discipline and hardened by months of war, had been impenetrable walls of authority. But now, something in their posture, in the subtle softness of their gestures, betrayed a humanity these prisoners had almost forgotten existed. The women's eyes flickered, searching for deception, for some hidden cruelty lurking behind the offered bread and blankets. Yet each gesture, each nod, each reassuring glance carried no hidden threat. It was real. It was as though the war itself had paused for a heartbeat, allowing compassion to assert itself in defiance of everything they had been taught to fear. A young woman, barely 18, with hair tangled and matted from weeks in the camp, pressed her hands to her chest as a soldier gently adjusted the blanket across her shoulders. The warmth seeped into her trembling frame, a sensation so ordinary yet profoundly extraordinary that tears threatened to spill from her eyes. Another woman, a former nurse, who had cared for the wounded in a hospital far from the front lines, allowed herself a breath she had long held in anticipation of her last moments. The tension that had coiled inside her like a tightly wound spring began to unwind, and for the first time, the future seemed uncertain not because of death, but because of the possibility of survival. Around them, whispers began to spread, not loud, not defiant, but soft. Incredulous murmurs carried on the winter air. They aren't going to WWII. One woman began, her words catching in her throat. Another simply shook her head, wide-eyed, unable to reconcile the reality with the dread had defined every step leading up to this moment. The women glanced at each other, searching for confirmation in the shared disbelief, and found it mirrored in every pale, frozen face. Fear had been a constant companion, a shadow that had followed them from one bleak day to the next. Yet now that shadow was fractured by a light they had never expected: empathy, deliberate and unwavering, shining through the cold, muted dawn. The soldiers moved among them with careful deliberation, offering gentle touches where needed, steadying hands, soft nods. These gestures, seemingly minor, carried immense weight. Each interaction shattered the expectation of cruelty and replaced it with something infinitely more human. The young nurse found herself catching a glimpse of the officer's eyes, not the steely gaze of a man accustomed to power, but eyes that held understanding and recognition of shared vulnerability. In that fleeting connection, a dialogue occurred without words, a transfer of courage and reassurance that the women clung to like lifelines. It was not the grandeur of heroism, not the spectacle of defiance against tyranny. It was something quieter, subtler, and infinitely more potent. Acknowledgement of their humanity at a moment when they had believed it irretrievably lost. Time seemed to stretch unnaturally as these small acts accumulated, each one layering upon the next, forming a protective veil over the women's fragile spirits. The snow continued to fall in gentle flakes, settling on the shoulders of those who had once expected death, but now felt an almost dizzying sense of relief. A former schoolteacher pressed her palms together, staring down at the bread in disbelief, the texture of the crust warm against her cold, cracked fingers. She had not eaten a proper meal in weeks, yet the gesture was less about nourishment and more about recognition, about being seen as a human being rather than a number in a ledger of war. Every sensory detail in the camp seemed heightened in those suspended moments. The crunch of boots against frost, hardened mud, the muted flapping of banners and flags that had once signaled allegiance and authority. The occasional caw of a crow perched atop a watchtower, All of it formed a symphony of tension, punctuated by the subtle counterpoint of unexpected mercy. The prisoners could feel it in the air, a shift that was both tangible and ephemeral. It was as though the very molecules of the frozen morning had conspired to remind them that the world was capable of more than destruction. That even amidst carnage, there was room for care, for recognition, for empathy that transcended uniforms and barbed wire. The women's minds struggled to process it. How could it be so simple, yet so profound? How could a handful of blankets, a few pieces of bread, and a nod of reassurance carry the weight of hope? In their conditioned worldview, small gestures were meaningless in the face of war's relentless machinery. Yet here, in the raw clarity of dawn, they realized that these gestures were not trivial. They were revolutionary. They were proof that humanity could exist even when surrounded by atrocity, proof that the rigid hierarchies of fear and violence could be momentarily suspended by deliberate acts of care. Some prisoners closed their eyes as the warmth of the blankets seeped in, imagining for the first time in weeks a future not dictated by the whim of another's power. Others clutched the bread to their chests, tasting not just sustenance, but the symbolism of being acknowledged, being valued, being seen. These small rituals, simple though they were, became lifelines that tethered them to the idea of life beyond the line, beyond the barbed wire, beyond the imminent shadow of death. For the soldiers, too, this moment was transformative. The rigidity of duty softened, the mechanical repetition of orders gave way to intentional care, and for a fleeting instant, war itself seemed to acquiesce to mercy. Whispers of astonishment spread further down the line, reaching even those who had remained stoic, hardened by months of hardship. A woman who had spent weeks in isolation, ruminating on fear and despair, finally allowed a shuddering breath to escape her lungs, the realization dawning that they were not simply being tolerated. They were being protected. The officer's gaze swept over the line once more, lingering just long enough to convey a silent promise that here, in this frozen expanse, they would not be abandoned to cruelty. The women's hearts, previously constricted by anxiety and expectation, expanded ever so slightly, embracing a flicker of possibility they had thought extinguished forever. As the minutes stretched into what felt like an eternity, the camp took on a surreal quality. The harshness of frost, the cold metal of fences, the looming wooden towers, all of it remained. Yet it no longer dominated the scene. Instead, the warmth of human connection, fragile and almost impossible, reframed the reality. The women leaned slightly toward one another, sharing glances of incredulity and relief, unspoken communication that conveyed trust, wonder, and tentative hope. Even the guards' movements seemed imbued with intention, the casual gestures of kindness now monumental against the backdrop of fear that had dominated the camp for so long. By the time the last blanket was distributed and the final morsel of bread passed down the line, a strange stillness settled over the entire expanse. The women, though still trembling, stood taller, hearts buoyed by the realization that life could assert itself in the most unexpected of forms. It was a quiet revolution, a challenge to the brutal calculus of war even in the coldest, most dire circumstances. Empathy could pierce the fog of fear and illuminate a path, however narrow, toward hope. In that moment, they understood that survival was no longer simply a matter of endurance. It was intertwined with the recognition of humanity, a gift extended from one person to another that had the power to reshape destiny. As the dawn light gradually strengthened, casting long golden hues over the frost-covered ground, the women absorbed the reality of the morning. They could still see the barbed wire, still hear the crunch of boots, still feel the bite of cold air, but now those sensations were tempered by the warmth they carried within. It was a warmth born not of physical shelter, but of a profound human acknowledgement they were not invisible, not disposable, not defined solely by fear or death. In that suspended moment, the camp became more than a stage of impending execution. It became a testament to the enduring capacity for compassion, a fragile sanctuary carved out of the brutality of war, however fleeting it might be. Even decades later, the memory of that morning would remain indelible for those who lived through it. The gestures, the soft nods, the warmth of bread and blankets, these would be recalled with the same intensity as the most harrowing moments of fear. For in that frozen camp, against all expectation, the women had been reminded of a fundamental truth: mercy, when extended deliberately and without pretense, has the power to transform despair into hope, to convert trembling anticipation into measured relief, to reaffirm life in the face of imminent death. By the time the sun rose fully over the frost-covered camp, the world seemed transformed. The line that had once symbolized fear and inevitable death now represented something altogether different. An intersection of survival, humanity, and the fragile, almost miraculous presence of compassion. The women, who had stood with shoulders hunched and eyes wide with dread, now walked with cautious relief, their breath still fogging in the cold morning air, yet lighter than it had been hours before. Every step they took was infused with disbelief. They had come to expect cruelty at every turn, yet the day had unfolded as a quiet testament to mercy, a defiance of everything they had been conditioned to anticipate. The camp, previously a tableau of despair, bore witness to this subtle transformation. The frost on the barbed wire sparkled under the rising sun. The wooden watchtowers seemed less menacing, softened by the warm glow. Even the mud, churned and bitter underfoot, appeared almost benign in the light of the women's newfound hope. As they moved away from the line where they had feared for their lives, there was a tangible shift in the air. Less tension, less rigid expectation of cruelty, more an almost reverent pause, as if the world itself acknowledged the extraordinary nature of what had just occurred. Each glance, each gesture, reinforced a truth that had previously seemed inconceivable, that human dignity could survive even amidst the machinery of war. One woman, a former teacher, paused and looked back at the officer who had stood at the head of the line. His expression, calm and almost contemplative, met hers, and in that fleeting exchange, a silent communication passed between them. It was a wordless acknowledgement of what had occurred, a recognition that lives had been preserved not merely through circumstance, but through deliberate acts of care and conscience. The soldiers themselves, who had been trained for obedience and efficiency, now bore witness to the power of choice in a world defined by orders and consequence. Their presence, once a source of fear, had become a conduit for understanding, proof that even within the hierarchies of war, compassion could assert itself, quietly but irrevocably. As the women walked away, they felt the weight of disbelief slowly give way to gratitude. Their eyes scanned the camp, drinking in details they had once ignored: the patterns of frost on the wooden fences, the distant horizon tinged with gold, the faint smoke rising from makeshift fires that had warmed the soldiers through the night. Each detail seemed to carry meaning, a silent testimony that the world could contain both cruelty and kindness simultaneously. Their movements, tentative at first, grew more assured as they internalized the lesson of the morning that life, even when threatened by the most imminent dangers, could be reaffirmed by simple, intentional acts of humanity. The air itself seemed to hum with a quiet reverence. The crunch of boots on frost-hardened ground, the gentle rustle of blankets, even the distant caw of a solitary crow, all were imbued with new significance. The women noticed the soft expressions of the soldiers as they lowered their weapons, their eyes no longer scanning for weakness, but reflecting respect and recognition. It was a moment of profound alignment, a brief suspension of the usual hierarchies and roles dictated by war. In this fragile equilibrium, the prisoners felt something previously unimaginable, a sense of safety, however tentative, and the ability to breathe without the constant premonition of harm. Every step forward was accompanied by reflections on what they had endured and what had been granted to them in return. Months of hunger, fear, and uncertainty had taught them the weight of suffering, yet in those few hours of unexpected compassion, they learned the magnitude of human resilience and empathy. A former nurse, who had spent nights tending to wounded soldiers and civilians alike, felt a renewed faith in the basic decency that could exist even amidst chaos. The warmth of the blankets, the taste of the bread, the gentle gestures of reassurance, each one became an emblem of survival, a tangible reminder that mercy could manifest in ways that transcended the machinery of war. The camp itself had once seemed oppressive, now bore witness to a quiet miracle. The fences no longer appeared merely as instruments of control. Instead, they framed a space where life had been affirmed. The watchtowers, once symbols of domination, now stood sentinel over a moment that could never be erased from memory. The frost-laden ground, previously treacherous and unforgiving, became a canvas upon which an extraordinary story of compassion had been painted. Even the harsh light of day, which had once accentuated every shadow of fear, now highlighted the resilience etched into the faces of the prisoners, a testimony to their survival and the enduring presence of humanity in the darkest times. As the morning deepened, conversations began to flow softly among the women. Whispers of incredulity mixed with laughter, subdued yet genuine, spread along the line as they recounted the moments of mercy they had experienced. Each retelling reinforced the sense that what had occurred was not a mere reprieve, but a transformative event, a lesson that would stay with them long after the war had ended. The camp had been designed to strip them of hope, to reduce life to fear and obedience, yet through a sequence of deliberate acts, it had become a stage for a quiet triumph of the human spirit. In these shared reflections, bonds were strengthened, solidarity reaffirmed, and an understanding of the profound impact of compassion emerged in ways that no textbook or lecture could ever capture. The soldiers who had participated in this delicate act of mercy also carried its weight. Their actions, small yet deliberate, became part of a narrative that transcended protocol and duty. Each glance, each gesture, each distribution of bread and blankets was an assertion that the human heart could defy expectation, that it could exercise discretion even when the machinery of war demanded uniformity and detachment. In this way, the morning became a mutual testament, a fleeting convergence of two worlds: the prisoners, vulnerable and fearful, and the soldiers, trained to enforce authority, yet capable of exercising empathy. Together, they created a memory that would outlast the harshness of the camp, the fear of the line, and even the echoes of battle itself. By mid-morning, the camp had shifted from a place of dread to a space of solemn reflection. The prisoners, having walked away from the line, paused occasionally to gather their bearings, to absorb the reality that life could continue despite the shadows of war. Some bent to pick up discarded blankets, offering silent gratitude. Others exchanged soft smiles, tentative but genuine. The realization that they had been spared, not by chance but by conscious choice, was overwhelming. It imbued the mundane act of moving through the camp with weight and significance. Every step, every glance, every interaction became a testament to the enduring power of mercy and the capacity of the human spirit to recognize and honor it. Even as the day advanced and the sun climbed higher, illuminating the frozen expanse of the camp, the memory of the morning's events remained vivid. The warmth of the blankets, the taste of the bread, the soft gestures of reassurance. All were etched into the consciousness of the prisoners. They would carry these memories not only as a record of survival, but as a profound reminder that even in the bleakest circumstances, moments of grace could exist. The ordinary had been transformed into the extraordinary, the expected cruelty replaced with an enduring lesson in empathy. And though the camp would continue to operate under the rules of war, those moments would stand apart, suspended in memory as a quiet triumph of humanity. As the women finally gathered their belongings and prepared to continue their day, there was a collective understanding that something fundamental had shifted. They had walked away from the line, not just physically, but spiritually. The camp with its fences, its mud, its watchtowers, and its cold air would remain the same to an outside observer. Yet, to those who had lived the experience, it had become sacred ground, a place where fear had been challenged by mercy, where despair had been pierced by human kindness, and where the potential for life had been affirmed against all odds. That morning would remain with them forever, a testament to the idea that compassion, even when brief and unexpected, possesses the power to redefine existence itself.